All right.
Good to see you guys.
Woo! And then turn it up.
It's been a while.
Thank you. Yeah. How you doing?
Good. Is this the new home?
No, we're moving in a month.
Oh my God. Okay.
We're moving.
Are you actually going to move in a month? Is that going to be able to happen?
Yeah, it's happening. We're moving to Lake Linganore. Did you ever get out that way?
No. Is it
Yeah.
a nice green suburb?
Well, it's right outside Frederick, and it's right on a lake. So I'm pretty excited. I get to buy a kayak and bike more and be outside, which I'm excited about. So
yeah.
We like Baltimore but don't love it. So
what's Baltimore like on lockdown? I mean, it's already such an empty city.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm such a hermit anyway, like I work from home.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it hasn't changed much. I mean, what's changed is that, Rachel's working from home now also.
Yeah.
So that's changed, and then, we're having a baby in September.
I do. Congratulations.
Which is,
so
thank you. Yeah, I'm going to be an old dad, so.
You're going to be a young dad.
Yeah.
Be a young dad for a little while.
Yeah, for a little while, for a couple of years, and then old dad territory. How are you?
We're doing well. We're still loving New Orleans. The weather's been absolutely gorgeous. We haven't had to use our air conditioning yet, so the bills have remained low.
Nice.
But it's been good. Sarah had COVID for a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Recovered, is absolutely fine now.
Okay.
They've just started antibody testing here, so I'm going to go get mine this week. We assume I probably had it since I was taking care of her for 2 weeks in an apartment together.
Yeah. Okay.
It'd be pretty. If I didn't get it, I must be really, really fucking good at washing my hands.
Yeah. Seriously.
I don't know how I could have avoided it otherwise.
How's Sarah's work?
It's good. It's slow right now because Louisiana, being the only southern state with a Democratic governor, actually managed to lock things down and flatten the curve very quickly, quicker than most other states. And so now she's got they've got very few new COVID patients coming in New Orleans.
Gotcha.
But none of the regular elective surgeons and stuff are coming back yet. So they've been overstaffed. So they've been encouraging them to take time off and stuff and get ready for the next wave if it comes.
Yeah. When it comes.
Yeah. I'm trying to be optimistic, but
Yeah, definitely.
We're staying pretty locked down here. It doesn't look like they're easing up anytime soon. So
that's good. That's really good. Yeah. I mean, I get the sense here in Baltimore that, it's a nice day also, but I get the sense that people are relaxing a little bit, maybe too much. I went for a bike ride earlier in Druid Hill Park, and just tons of people out, really. So you get the sense that, this is the time when we really need to kind of hunker down, and that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you look outside and you think, oh, well, I don't see, it doesn't look like the scenes, from New York where everyone's crowded together and you see hospital workers dragging bodies into trucks and stuff. So everyone's like, it's not here.
Yeah. Or I'll meet up with some friends at the park and it'll be fine, kind of thing, which is like, I sort of understand. I'm sort of still a little hesitant about doing stuff like that, I know.
So. I guess we still don't know how the antibodies affect immunity, but it seems like it at least offers some protection, so that's good.
Yeah, for sure.
So tell me about your new comic.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. So, I've been working on it for, so sort of, I guess maybe the history of the project, right? So it emerged, so I did my dissertation in Detroit. I did approximately 2.5 years of field work, of ethnographic field work. I'm a geographer, I have my PhD in geography, so I did ethnographic field work. And, I looked at a lot of different sort of housing issues in Detroit for my PhD, and I sort of did this kind of dual track kind of thing, right? I did the research for my dissertation, but then I also collected interviews for a comic book that I knew that I wanted to write. So the comic book really emerges out of this 2.5 years of field work I did, which entailed, participant observation, which is basically going and working with and being part of groups as a way of understanding and sort of knowing what groups are about, sort of almost like using your body as sort of like a research tool to understand the practices of activism and that kind of stuff. So I did that, and then I collected about 35 interviews from across the board, really. So anywhere from like people that collect data on housing in Detroit, to people that do maps of Detroit, to lawyers, to activists, to homeowners, right? So it's really just kind of this wide spectrum of interviews that I had. So I had about 35 interviews, and over the course of, after I finished my dissertation, over the course of about, I would say, like a year and a half, really when you were in Baltimore was really when I was writing it. I whittled those 35 interviews down to about 8 interviews for the book. And that book is going to be about 200 pages long, hopefully, right? So we're crowdfunding for it right now. And really the crowdfunding on Kickstarter. And the title of the book is We Live Here, Detroit Eviction Defense in the Battle for Housing Justice. That's on Kickstarter. And so the Kickstarter is going to determine how many stories I can basically include in the book, right? So we're looking at about 100 to 110 pages right now. Ideally, like my ideal book is a 200-page book that includes these 8 stories that I sort of have whittled down from the larger 35 stories from my field work.
Interspersed with the stories is also data and things like that. Is that the idea?
No, so it's so the narrative structure of the book. So how's the book set up, right? So the book focuses on this 5-year sort of celebratory anniversary of Detroit eviction defense. So the group I worked with in Detroit is this group called Detroit Eviction Defense, DED, and they are a really interesting group. They're an activist group, and they define themselves as not a NGO and not a charitable organization, right? Really, the group is essentially homeowners coming together that are facing some sort of eviction and a handful of activists. The group really doesn't have any resources other than sort of their collective, I guess, knowledge of how to sort of organize, right? So the book then the narrative structure of the book then works through this celebration, right? Because one thing that I really wanted to emphasize with this book, and really, even in the title, like We Live Here, is this idea that, and to really hedge against this idea that, because I think Detroit often is imagined as sort of this post-apocalyptic landscape, right? Like devoid of people. Like on the one hand, it's like devoid of people, and it's sort of ripe for kind of like settler colonialism, right? Kind of idea, like come here and get sheep property and garden, that kind of shit, right? So that's sort of like the one vision of it. And then the other vision is sort of like this capitalist utopian comeback, right? Where it's like, the Dan Gilberts are buying all of the property in downtown, and isn't this great? And there's restaurants and all this kind of stuff. And really, I think absent in that narrative are sort of the everyday people in Detroit that have been there, right? That have been there, have lived their whole lives there, and are still there, and now are oftentimes being driven out of the city, right? Either from this, like, out of this kind of story of comeback, right? Whether that's the settler story or whether that's sort of the capitalist utopian story, which are definitely interrelated. But it's often a story of that. So the book is trying to hedge against that, right? So I'm trying to place people, everyday Detroiters, at the center of the book. And I think what's really interesting also about DED, and why I wanted to focus on a celebration as the narrative structure, is that this group is like very successful, right? They've won like 80 or 90 homes over the course of like the last 10 years, right? And these are people that oftentimes that come into the group and are part of the group are on the brink of losing their home, right? They've got no other options left. Like the dumpsters out front the bailiff's at my door, what do I do kind of situations. And DED's been able to organize, with these people, and been able to win their homes back. And I think that these are really positive, amazing stories. So the book then works through that celebration. And the celebration was basically like there was an MC, right? And then people would come up and recount their stories, right? So it sort of works through that kind of structure of that celebration. So that's the narrative structure of the book.
And this sort of, it's your last book, The Instinct for Cooperation.
Oh, thank you.
Has a very different structure. This is you in conversation with Noam Chomsky. And
yeah.
There's you wearing the same hat that you got on now. And that's him.
I gotta stay in character.
Like coughing. This looks uncomfortably close now these days, but
yeah, all right.
But I mean, this is as someone who's not that familiar with comic books or not that familiar with contemporary comic books and graphic novels, that seems like an unusual format to me. And this one that you've got now seems less so, but still it seems like a not a typical kind of just your thing. It's almost like a 1,001 Nights kind of thing. You've got people standing up and telling their stories, or the Decameron or something like that. It's actually a very old form of narrative. Yeah,
absolutely. And my background in comics, I mean, this is kind of maybe a good segue into how I got into all this. But I'm not like a superhero guy, right? So I don't have like this sort of typical, I can't like say like, oh, 10 years old, I had all the Spider-Man comics or something. Like that's not how I came into this at all. I came into this actually through my work that I did in sort of like organizing work I did in the West Bank, right, in Palestine, and then coming into Joe Sacco's comic books, right? Yeah. So yeah, and I actually got to interview Joe, and I think it might be one of the first comic books to appear in a peer-reviewed scholarly journal. So in 2012, I interviewed Joe, and then it's in this scholarly journal called Geographic Review. But yeah, so I came into it from that perspective. I came into it thinking about the sort of ethnographic perspective. And then,
like, as a child, you didn't have like any connection with comics?
Not really.
That's really interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I read them a little bit, but not a lot, And so really reading Sacco's work, and then sort of this experience that I had in the West Bank, I had like these 400 or 500 photos that I had taken of the work that we were doing, and I was working on my master's, and I was trying to think about the ways in which I could incorporate those photos into my master's work, right? So that's really where it came from for me, and also like once I started reading comic books, they just made sense to me, and it's a way that I can write. I do have my PhD, but I do struggle writing in that sort of academic sort of way. Yeah, it's really no fun. A lot of times it's not fun.
And it doesn't resonate with very many people. Only certain kind of people can sit through reading that.
Yeah, exactly. And that was kind of my entry point into it. I was thinking out from anthropology and thinking about like, well, I know all of these anthropologists have all these amazing experiences, but then they sort of get relegated to these scholarly journals, right? Or expensive press books that are like $35 that often follow a really sort of formulaic kind of like structure.
And the only people that read it are the students in their classes that they assign them to.
Yeah, right. So it's like, well, you have all these really interesting experiences, then how can we actually try to engage and embrace people beyond academia, right? So that's really how I came into it and came into thinking about graphic novels. So part of my master's was like recounting my experience that I had in the West Bank through comic books. And to be clear, like I write, I don't illustrate comic books. So my method is to take the interviews, work through the interviews, think about what kind of visual information is really in the interviews.
Mm.
And then what I do is I construct a script around that. And I think panel by panel about what each panel should look like. I mean, even like the perspectives, kind of angles, all that kind of stuff I write out. And then along with the dialogue, and then I collaborate, as I'm doing with the Italian illustrator Bambi Kramer for this book. We collaborate and then sort of bring the work to life. Is how this came about. I would also say
mythology built around it, or a narrative that's common in popular culture. Then you've got an Italian collaborator on this, someone who's international. Do they bring? Does Bambi bring something from his country to this that enriches it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with Bambi, what I was really looking for is the other illustrators that I worked for. Their illustration style is a little bit harder, I guess, right? The lines are a little bit flatter. And what I really was looking for Bambi was like more of an artistic and fluid style. Because really what I wanted to be able to do was be able to think about like how memory works, and then how to be able to sort of like visually represent memory within these sort of stories. Because oftentimes, what we're doing is like I have an interview and then they're recounting something, right? And then then I go into the text and try to deal with that memory. So, yeah, what Bambi brings is this amazing sort of fluid, really artistic sort of style to it, which I really love, and we're just sort of in the early stages of the book. So I'm going to be really excited to see like what she brings and how she understands Detroit, from the
How did you two
picture
meet and start collaborating?
We met through my agent.
Okay, that's nice.
So, yeah, so not a very
Well,
I guess romantic.
That's nice to hear an agent doing their job.
Yeah, no, it was great.
It was
Yeah, it was great.
It was nice when that happens.
Yeah. So it's been great to work with Bambi. What else? I guess, one other point that I just kind of want to make is I also had to make a decision pretty early on, because I think because this came out of academia, there's this like huge desire to theorize comics. Right? Like that could have been a track for me. Like, oh, you take Foucault or Deleuze and you apply it to comic books, right? Sure. So I had to make a really
great way to suck the fun out of comic books.
Oh yeah, yeah, exactly. Totally, right? Yeah. So I had to make a real early decision to not do that. Like to specifically say like my interest in comic books is in the creation of it, right? And then sort of how that works, rather than like taking other people's work and trying to
seems like the reverse of what I hear from a lot of people I know in academia who are interested in comics. They are interested in theorizing about comics. They're not comic creators themselves. So you're sort of doing the opposite of what's typical in academia.
Yeah. I mean, it's also just because, like I said, like I'm not very good at writing academic text to begin with. So, I mean, it's just it just would have been torturous, you know what I mean, to try to then, and like you said, I think it would have taken a lot of the fun out of it. Yeah. I mean, there are people that theorize comics. I don't want to totally throw it under the bus. There are people that theorize comics that do it that are great. I just personally had to make that decision that I'm more interested in creating them than I am in theorizing them,
Have you read Lucky Jim by Kingsley Amis?
No, I haven't. Tell me.
It's one of the great campus satires, and in it, the main character has been avoiding writing his dissertation on 14th century shipbuilding for several years. It's really because he doesn't give a shit about 14th century shipbuilding. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the interesting thing too is like the Chomsky book came out while I was writing my dissertation.
Mm,
Right. So it's like, yeah, I definitely distracted myself from the
right.
dissertation. I was like, oh, I'll write this comic book and then
Yeah.
I'll take 7 years to get my dissertation done.
Yeah. I mean, the comic was pretty impressive. I also so what about fictional comic books? Do you read or are your interest just in nonfiction?
I mean, I read a little bit of fiction, right? So I try to go through some of the, I mean, there is value in, like I'm reading Chris Ware's new book right now, and he's like, he's huge for me in terms of like what he brings to comic books. So there's definitely a value in fiction comics.
I don't know Chris Ware. What does Chris Ware do?
He wrote this book called Jimmy Corrigan, and it's, yeah. So it's these really deep dives into individual people's sort of psychology and also memory, and also not just memory, but people's past, like how they understand their relatives and their relationships and sort of the repetition often of people's lives. And it really is a focus on the everyday also, which I really appreciate. And then sort of visually, I think what he brings is something that I haven't seen anybody else in comic book really bring, in terms of how he deals with memory specifically. So yeah, so I definitely read fiction, comics, but my interest is definitely in listening to and trying to understand other people's stories, really. Right, so I'm interested in interviewing people. I'm interested in their stories, and I'm interested in trying to present their stories in an honest way. Because there is, like, a thread in comic.
You're doing journalism here.
Yeah, sort of. I hesitate a little bit to call myself a journalist, and I don't know why. Because I do. Yeah, I mean, for me, the sort of ethnographic is like still really important in all of this. Getting into a place, living there, participating. Yeah, I mean, so maybe that line between journalism and ethnography is a little bit of a fine line. But I never considered myself like a journalist in the sense that, like, I don't know, like you parachute into a place. Sure. Get a story.
Joe Sacco is a journalist, right? I mean,
kind of leave. Yeah, he definitely, pioneered that comics journalism. Yeah, so definitely what I do is along the lines of what Sacco does, for sure. Definitely.
Do you know what your next topic's going to be?
Oh, that's a good question.
You've been working on this one for a while now, so you probably when it's done.
Yeah, I mean, you know how it is. You never really want, you always deserve a break, but you never really want one, right? Yeah. I mean, you want to keep writing.
I feel like I've got a break now, but it doesn't feel very restful.
Yeah. Yeah, so the next book, I'm not sure. There's a couple of projects out there. There's possibly doing some work on undocumented communities in Tucson. Okay. Which would emerge out of like some of my friends' research. So there's that book. There's a book on worker cooperatives I've been thinking about in the country, and then maybe a book on student loan debt also. Okay. I think that there's sort of.
I'd be interested to see how that would translate to a comic book.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it could be. I think people's stories, my own story of student loan debt is, sad. And I think that like many other people's stories are sad also. And I have never really seen sort of a concentrated place where people just talk about it, right? And I think the connection really with the DED book is that, because we're both dealing with kinds of debt, right? Whether we're dealing with a mortgage or whether we're dealing with student loan debt, is that there's an incredible amount of shame around falling behind, right? Yeah. And that one of the really important things about Detroit eviction defense is that they provide you a space to not feel ashamed, provide you a space to not feel alone, right, in this, right? Because often, these things are often constructed around like individual failure, right? Like you are just a bad person because you can't pay X, Y, and Z, right? And I think that people then just internalize this and just sort of move on.
Humiliating, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely humiliating, right? So I think part of both of those stories, I'm just thinking kind of aloud here, but like part of both of those stories is that aspect of coming together and sharing stories and not feeling ashamed about the situation that you're in, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that'd be a potent way to explore student debt. You could probably find a whole range of experiences. Talk about.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's. Go ahead.
No, continue.
No, I was just gonna say. I mean, it's something that you could just see stories pouring in, right? I mean, it's.
I mean, it's one of those things that everyone sort of commiserates about, but nobody really wants to go into detail about it, and it's like I think Americans have this kind of reticence to talk about money matters outside of abstract terms. Like they don't.
Yeah.
You can. When I was at journalism school, and they said, well, the thing about reporting in New York is people won't tell you how much money they make, but they'll tell you how much rent they pay. So there are weird ways to have these conversations without getting to the sort of nub of the real situation. People don't. People don't talk about how much debt they have. They just say they have a lot. They move on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I sort of have played around with those lines a little bit too, at least in my class, right? Like I'll tell the students how much student loan debt I'm in, right? It's just a way of like.
That's great.
And it's, it's both a personal thing of just trying to say like, okay, it's out there, but it's also like to try to make them realize that it's not something to be ashamed of necessarily. Yeah. Right? So, So.
I feel like lately I've been reading a lot of not comic books, but a lot of psychogeographic memoirs have been very popular lately. We just finished reading for our book club here, The Yellow House.
Okay.
Have you read that?
I don't know. No, tell me about it.
It's about a young black woman who grew up in New Orleans East, and it's about the history of this part of New Orleans that's sort of ignored in the story that's usually told about New Orleans. And it's about several generations of her family and how her family coped with Katrina and various other things. It was a good book. It had parts of it that I liked, parts that I didn't like. But there's that. Also, the other one that sprang to mind was that made a big splash was Hillbilly Elegy. Another one that's about sort of coming from an underreported place. Based on those things. Why do you think, if those things are becoming more popular, as a professor of geography, why do you think that is?
Good question. I mean, I think it's because place matters, right? And I think that stories are always compelling when you can work them out from a place and give. I mean, the thing about, the Detroit book is that Detroit is a character, right? And that's something that we're specifically trying to think about. Not only the city as a character, but like, Detroit's 140 square miles, right?
Oh, yeah.
So it's a gigantic city. So there isn't just a Detroit, right? There's lots of different Detroits. So part of that trying to create a sense of place, right, is to try to also hedge against this narrative, I guess, of Detroit as this singular place, right? So to try to understand, through the 8 stories, the different neighborhoods that people are coming out of, right? So there's one story, a story of Marie Sims, who's this AT&T worker, and, AT&T sort of ran her out of there, out of her job. She was like a receptionist and did sort of like had an office job, and then she found herself like being retrained to like climb poles, right, to like fix lines kind of stuff, right? And she ended up like not being able to do it, and she lost her job. And she went through a foreclosure, but was able to save her home. But her story, right, and part of that chapter is going to be about, she comes from this neighborhood called Black Bottom in Detroit, and this is a really famous neighborhood in the city that, like, in the 30s and 40s had like lots of jazz clubs. It's where Joe Louis, was born. and grew up. And, but it's also part of this sort of urban renewal story where the city decided to bulldoze the neighborhood and put a highway, put I-75 right through the middle of it, right? So
you should read the Yellow Room. There's a whole section about how they bulldozed Claiborne Avenue, which used to be like the black shopping district, and put a highway on it.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So the point is that there's lots of different Detroits, and this displacement of people out of Black Bottom is like part of that story of this particular part of Detroit, right? So yeah, I think that, for me at least, stories about places that really give you a deep contextualization of a place, right? Where you begin to understand, New York or New Orleans or Detroit is something more complex than sort of the popular imagination about it is always great for me, right?
You said place matters. Do you think place matters more now that we're so connected via social media and stuff, or does it matter less being physically in a place? Do you think people are more fascinated by that idea? And I'm talking about before this whole lockdown. We can go into what the lockdown how that might affect us afterwards. Yeah. But just in general, in the past, 20 years with the rise of the internet, people have said, well, place doesn't matter as much anymore because everyone's so connected now.
I mean, again, it's the kind and type of connectivity I think that's important, right? And I do think that, I always kind of think out from activism. So I think that there is something about, and I could even relate this to my classes being live or being online, right? I think that there is something about being in a physical place with people, right? Having that sort of connection with people that actually matters. And you think of, I think of the space that DED meets at, right? Like this like old church on Jefferson Avenue, and they meet there every week. And there's something about that place, about people coming together in that place, right? Being physically together, being able to see each other, that builds connections, I would say, in a way that is more difficult over sort of the internet or sort of like a Zoom meeting, right?
Right.
I think that being in a place matters, and we can even think of this in sort of a larger sort of context. I just did a section on Standing Rock, right? And the protests around the Dakota Access Pipeline, and a lot of the scholars talking about that are talking about the importance of place, the fact that 7 nations came together for the first time, right, in one place, right, and we're able to experiment with different ways of interacting, right? Sort of experiment with like how to take care of each other in sort of a mutual way. How to have a kitchen for everybody, how to have all these different kinds of things, right? That we also see, which gets back to the Chomsky book a little bit. We also see happening in Zuccotti Park,
right?
Yeah, Occupy Wall Street, which then became this place, right, where people met up consistently, and there was this interaction, and it becomes a place in which you can experiment with different kinds of. It's where you can, your imagination can sort of like.
You think, they're sort of like small scale versions of Republican Spain or Iraqi Kurdistan or something.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Like those, absolutely. So I think that there is something about the physicalness, right, of the space and coming together and, experimenting with how we can take care of each other, which I think and maybe that's it. It's experimenting with how we can take care of each other, which then becomes sort of a different thing online. You know what I mean? And not that the online thing is worse, it's just becomes this different thing, I think. So
it reminds me of, the Supreme Court just heard their first ever audio arguments, and it was open to the public.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Did you hear about the toilet flush?
No.
There was someone flushed the toilet in the background. The best comment was what is it that was something like that was Alito's best commentary in years or something like that. But it's the whole thing about the Supreme Court is that it's not open to the public. There are no cameras in there. You have to walk through columns and statues in these grand halls, and these people appear with black robes on. suddenly it's online and you're hearing toilets flush. It's like, oh man, maybe this isn't as, you know, sacred as we all thought it was. Maybe these are just people.
Yeah. I think, yeah. And the word sacred, I think, sort of resonates, especially in the case of the Supreme Court, right? Because the Supreme Court is like given to us through translation, right? So it's able to then have that sort of sacredness, right?
Yeah.
Like you're sort of talking about. And then sort of having it live, then, or, you know, your access to place is different, then changes that, yes, you know. Yeah, definitely. Where are we at?
I forgot what they were. Huh?
I said, where are we in terms of time? Are we okay?
I think we still got about 15 minutes.
Okay, cool.
So, how did the first book come about? It was something about you. It was. I mean, I remember you explained to me almost. It was sort of accidental, almost. Like
the Chomsky book.
Intentional.
So my intent was really to interview him because I had a connection to him. So I was like, cool, I'll interview Chomsky. That'll be fun. And really my intent was I was teaching like an anthropology class, and I was doing a section on social movements, and I was like, it's 2011, and I was like, this would be great to talk to them about Occupy. And I can just do a short 10-page thing for my students, and then I'll have this material that I can use in other classes. So, I went out to MIT when he was there and interviewed him, and, that was great. And, just really humbling also, because I think one of the amazing things about Chomsky is like, why would he give me 2 minutes of his time? So I think it's a really important lesson sort of going forward that like trying to be respectful if someone asks you for something, is important to try to engage with them, right? So I went out there and I interviewed him, and then I quickly realized that like our short 30-minute interview, there was just tons of material there. And the thing about Chomsky is like he's not, there's not much narrative there, right? So, I mean, one thing that I really, really need, and when I interview people, is, I often say like, well, take me there, right? Take me to the place, take me to that protest, to try to get that visual information out of them, because that's the stuff that I really need when I'm writing comic books. I need visual information.
You really are doing journalism. I mean, whether you call it that or not, that is what you're doing.
Yeah. So, I need this rich visual information to be able to then translate into a comic book. And Chomsky isn't that, right?
Sure.
Chomsky's he's like the opposite of that. He's like
Captain Footnotes.
Yeah, totally, right? So it's just like, and the word footnote's really important here, because it's, he'll say something like, I mean, this is an example I often use, but like we're chatting back and forth, we're talking about Zuccotti Park, talking about, the books being removed from the library. And then he said, he has a comment like, well, Tucson knows all about that. And then he goes on and starts talking about something else, right? So if I was a journalist, like, what the hell do you do with that line, right? Like, you probably edited it out or something, right? Because it's like, unless you want to try to contextualize it. So what I quickly realized is that I could take lines like that footnote, like you were saying, and then I can sort of like open it out within the comic book.
Yeah.
So when he was talking about when he was talking about Tucson knows all about that, he was talking about the banning of Mexican American studies within Tucson Unified School District, right? So Arizona passes this law that says that schools can't teach any ethnic solidarity, right?
Okay.
Like, this is just like incredibly racist, sort of law, right? And they're targeting
what was the wording of that law that seems so crazy that something that could get passed?
Well, no, that was it. You can't, classes can't teach ethnic solidarity, right? So it's this idea that like kind of like we're all individuals, right? I mean, it comes out of that sort of Republican, like, we're all individuals, kind of thing. Sure. But is that, I mean, it is like that, literally that language within it. but it was really targeted, right? So they wanted to go after Tucson Unified School Districts and after the Mexican American Studies program, because the superintendent of education or whatever his name is, like, got really pissed off at this program. So anyway, what I did then is, the one chapter stops with Chomsky saying Tucson knows all about that, and then I incorporate 3 stories from two teachers and 1 student that was involved in the Mexican American Studies program, which is this hugely successful program that like took kids that were sort of failing, brought them into the Mexican American Studies program, taught them about their history in a way that they hadn't learned about before, and really sort of embraced them, and their graduation rates were great and all of this kind of stuff. So the book really attempts to kind of to take those footnotes and sort of visually give them some context, right? So then I have 4 or 5 other interviews that are included there. Talking about it. So, yeah.
I think we've got a few more minutes. I just wanted so you and I, when we first became friends, we bonded over music and fashion and mod stuff and all that. I sort of want to know your origins in that, as well as how that dovetails with your activism. Because I think the 2 things are somewhat related, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so punk rock origin stories. I grew up in the country, right? Mm-hmm. So I grew up in this small farm town in mid-Michigan, right? So music then became sort of a way of expanding one's imagination beyond sort of the context that you were in, mm-hmm. right? So for me, it was, first of all, finding bands like the Ramones, right, was always kind of an entry to a lot of this stuff. And then from there, it was sort of like really basic stuff like, which is actually related to Detroit, like, being 16 years old and Rancid is playing at St. Andrews Hall, 1995, right? And then like talking my next door neighbor into driving me down there, right, to go see them, and like having this like life-altering experience, right? And, they kind of then offer a gateway into bands like The Clash and like more sort of political bands like that, right? And then do you remember that Anal Cunt song, Rancid Sucks and The Clash Suck Too? Yeah, right.
It had the lyric, London is calling, it's calling you gay.
Yeah, totally.
Anyway, sorry, continue.
No, yeah. No, then for me, it gets into like bands like Propagandhi. Mm-hmm. And then it's just like really just kind of meeting up with other kids from other small towns that happen to be in this like random shit, you know what I mean? And then it's like, obviously things like Maximum Rock and Roll become like really important, mm-hmm. Sort of pre-internet, like how do you learn about this stuff, right? It becomes like Punk Planet, those kind of magazines become these like crucial things, right? To like a world that is beyond you, right? Yeah. And then it's all like kind of political bands that follow out of that,
So did the politics come out of the music, or was it the same time, or what?
For me, it was like more of the music. It started with the music, and then sort of, these things are always hard to like categorize because it's always like I never liked being told what to do. Do you know what I mean? Sure. To begin with. So like punk then is like an obvious sort of like way into that, right?
It's either that or libertarianism. Really.
Yeah, right. Oh God, yeah. I mean,
there's a two but not being told what to do.
Yeah, but that is interesting though, right? Because especially coming from a small town,
sure,
you are right on a knife's edge there.
Yeah.
Right. So as cliche and as stupid as it kind of might sound, like bands like Rage Against the Machine, even, right, getting popular and going into these towns with 2,000 people, right, mm-hmm. offer you a way out to channel your anger in sort of this progressive way where, like, there's easily, like, you could have easily gone, like, into really dumb right-wing shit.
Sure.
Right out of that. So that stuff becomes, super important, I think. But for me, it was like punk rock and then getting involved in college activism really sort of changed my thinking about politics, I would say, because there was this group, Students for Economic Justice, And there was a really vibrant, at the time, sort of student activist movement, I feel like, around 2003, 2004 in the country, specifically around United Students Against Sweatshops. And felt like that was like a massive political education, like how those groups were organized and what we did and all that kind of stuff. So,
do you think maybe your evolution into comic books as a way of talking about politics and culture, do you think that's because it's a sort of youth medium? Do you think that's analogous to your experience with music introducing you to politics?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I mean,
I'm not saying it's not the kind of medium that adults can enjoy, but I feel like punk rock and comic books are specifically mediums that are like associated with youth, at the very least.
Yeah. I mean, I think the comic books in a lot of ways is like just me doing what wasn't supposed to do in grad school. Do you know what I mean? And that might have been like unconsciously, just been like, you know what? I really like hanging out with my friends, reading philosophy and that kind of stuff, but then I get into this institution and it kind of sucks.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not great at writing in sort of the way you want me to write. So then, like, what am I going to do here? So I think maybe that would be the punk rock connection. Is just like, and I, you sort of get like whiffs of this from like dissertation committee and people around it. Like, I just get the sense, especially at this last conference, that like, I never asked to include a comic book in my dissertation.
Right.
Like, you're supposed to do that. And I was like, no. Like, why would I ask my dissertation committee if I'm going to do that? It's my dissertation, right? But apparently, like, that was a big thing.
Huh. Okay.
And of course, like, in academia, everything's super passive-aggressive, right? They never really outright tell you yes or no a lot of times. You know what I mean? So,
were they annoyed that you hadn't asked their permission to do a comic book?
I think that they were, actually, a little bit. Yeah. And I think that, like, the focus on the comic books was definitely, like, kind of like, better be glad that you had me on your dissertation committee.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah. So, so there's a little bit of that going on with it. So, yeah, the connection to punk rock is definitely this, like, I don't know, maybe me being ambivalent, but also me just being like, this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think we're about to run out of time. Tell everybody, and by everybody, I don't know, the dozen people watching, where the Kickstarter or GoFundMe is.
Yeah, so the Kickstarter is, it's on Kickstarter. It's called, if you just type in We Live Here. So we're at about $7,000 right now. We'd really like to get to 10,000. That way we can add more books or more stories into the conversation. I will just say one other thing too. Our mutual friend Rob is going to be doing a happy hour soul nights on Monday. To help. Yeah, from 5 to 7. Save your soul. He's going to be spinning some 45s related to Detroit as sort of a way of like getting the word out even more. So super excited about that, and that he's doing that. It should be fun. Is that
going to be on Instagram Live or?
It's going to be on both. So it's going to be on Facebook Live and Instagram Live, and that's Save Your Soul. Should be able to find that there. But yeah,
that's the thing that Sarah. I mean, other than you guys and Jason, Save Your Soul is the thing that Sarah and I miss the most about Baltimore.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's like legendary.
It's one of the greatest dance parties I've ever been to. I mean, I've been to. There's a mod party here in New Orleans. It's been going for about 20 years or something.
Oh wow, great!
It's fun, but it's not even close to like. It's not. It's like a hardcore people that go each week. Save Your Soul is like everyone from all walks of life in the city comes to that party.
Oh yeah, and then it's in this Lithuanian hall, which is like, talk about place, like giving it this environment.
That awful honey shot.
Yeah,
like an instant hangover.
Yeah, you can't get that on a Zoom hangout. I will say that.
No, that's
So-
true. We have to order some Svirtus or whatever it's called. I don't know. Thanks for chatting,
Yeah.
man. It's great to
Yeah,
talk to
man,
you.
it was great seeing you.
Um,
Thank you so much for doing this.
And congrats
Yeah.
on the forthcoming kiddo.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm pretty excited. So
I look forward to meeting Nathaniel Wilson, which I expect you will never meet. But let's do a Zoom chat.
yeah, let's talk soon, man.
with the four of us.
All right, sounds good. All our best to Sarah.
Yeah, you too. Night.